up, you guys? The Curious Owl here, and today I'm going to be reviewing New Spring by Robert Jordan. So if you guys did not watch my October D20 TBR and all my spooky reads video basically that I had done, I had picked out New Spring as a book I was going to either do a rant or very much liked review of some kind. I was gonna do some kind of a review for this book. So I did read this in October and I actually kind of liked it quite a bit. My rating necessarily wouldn't reflect that, but there were just some issues I had in terms of the overall length and pacing of the story, but we'll get into that in a second. New Spring is the prequel story to the Wheel of Time series. This takes place 20 years before the events of The Eye of the World, or the first book in the Wheel of Time series. Now, this follows two very important characters that we meet in the first book, The Eye of the World. Moiraine, who is an Aes Sedai, basically in training at this point, and a character named Lan, who is a soldier working in the kingdom and has just come out of this really big battle. So we pick up with Lan essentially in the prologue right after this huge battle that has basically been going on, and you start to see that there are these interesting creatures or things that they were trying to fight that all of a sudden just disappear, and everyone is like, okay, well, cool, we just won this battle, now let's all go home. And so that's kind of what we see for the majority of Lan's story, is him heading back toward home, specifically this place that is like the pinnacle of the Aes Sedai, which is where we bring in Moiraine. Moiraine is, like I said, an Aes Sedai in training, and Aes Sedai are basically magic-wielding women. They are specifically women who are able to use different kinds of elemental magic. They can sometimes wield multiple, but they start off with like taking one or two at a time and then finding ways to weave those things together to create magical powers. Now, Moiraine is pretty much not necessarily like at the top of her novice training. She's kind of what they consider like an apprentice of sorts, or I believe what's called an accepted, where basically she is pretty well off. She's been training for a long time and is getting ready to go into this big event where she's going to basically prove her power and prove her worth. This test of her abilities will basically place her, if she succeeds in it, with one of the various different kinds of Aes Sedai. They're basically associated by color, and each color represents a different kind of working that she will likely do as an Aes Sedai. And the girls do get to choose who they go with, and she and her best friend basically decide that they're going to try to go for the same color, and because they think that it's going to work best for them, and they also don't want to be separated. Unfortunately though, at the very beginning of Moiraine's story, we learn that one of the higher ups of the Aes Sedai, one of the women that have been around for a very long time, one in particular who is basically a seer of sorts, has this vision and then ultimately dies of basically what I would consider like a heart attack or stroke or something like that. This particular vision she has is about what they call the Dragon Reborn. It is a birth of a child that is likely to essentially change the face of the entirety of time and the working of the country and the kingdom. And Moiraine and her best friend don't really know what to think of this. They don't know if this was just something that is, you know, being told as like it's going to happen years down the line, whatever it is. But the head Aes Sedai essentially says that they're going to start trying to find who this child may be for whatever purpose. We don't really know what their purpose is in terms of finding this child, whether they're going to protect him or kill him or what exactly is going on here. But Moiraine is then basically thrust into finding this child, and as she and her best friend start to dig deeper into the Dragon Reborn and starting to try to find where this baby is, they start to realize that this could really change a lot of things. And the further they get into this whole thing, they start to realize the political ramifications of it, and they have to make a decision of whether or not they're going to basically stay within the Aes Sedai's rule or if they're going to go on their own. And what we learn is that toward the end of this, somewhere along the way, Moiraine and Lan kind of come together. Lan is not very trustworthy of Aes Sedai. He feels that they, like many people in this world, are just kind of people you don't want to mess with, because while they may help you in some situations, they will turn their backs on you just as quickly. And so he doesn't really trust the Aes Sedai. But when he and Moiraine end up actually meeting up, they realize that Lan has some kind of innate qualities that make him also a possibly magic wielding individual. And so by the end of this, what we learn is that Lan is able to become a ward, which essentially is in this world a kind of buffer for the Aes Sedai. They are a companion that is lifelong, that travel with them all the time, and they essentially not only will help tamper some of the very intense magic that the Aes Sedai will use, but they can also be, in a sense, a intensifier, amplifier, I guess, depending on the kind of magic that's being used, because since wards have a small kind of magic wielding ability, they're able to help the Aes Sedai in a lot of ways. Now, essentially, this is, like I said, toward the end of this. This book is 318 pages, basically, and what I really liked about it was I loved the exploration of the world, specifically about the Aes Sedai, because we get a lot more information about Moiraine and the Aes Sedai than we do about Lan and the rest of the country. So this is really more so Moiraine's story and just kind of how she meets up with Lan, and we get to see parts of Lan and kind of where he's from. What I really liked, like I said, is the construction of the Aes Sedai and understanding that Moiraine is kind of like a rebel in some cases. She tries to be the dutiful student, she tries to do, you know, the right thing, but when it comes to this really important thing that the Aes Sedai are asking for her to do, she doesn't feel like it's 100% right, and she feels like she has to protect this child, because somewhere along the way she starts to think of what are the possibilities of what the Aes Sedai could be doing, and it doesn't spell good news, and she just has this kind of very deep-seated need to protect this child and find out who it is and do something with them, whether it's get them to where they need to be on this journey to actually fulfill this prophecy of sorts, or protect them at the very least. We don't really 100% know, and a lot of that goes into what happens in the Eye of the World, because the Eye of the World, we see who exactly that Dragon Reborn child is, who is the main character of the entirety of the Wheel of Time. The one thing though I really wish I would have seen more is I wanted the book to be a little bit longer, because the way that this ended was that essentially Lan becomes the ward of Moiraine, and then they kind of go on their journey and disappear into the sunset. There's not really a lot dictating how exactly they work together, what their relationship entails in terms of workings, things like that. So I would have liked for this to be a little bit longer, and then therefore paced a little bit slower, just so that we could kind of see what exactly happens. On top of that, I did feel like there were a lot of chunks I don't remember about this, specifically in terms of Lan, because Lan's storyline was almost non-existent. We didn't really understand a lot of what happened. Like, I can tell you more about what happened to Moiraine, because her particular chapters were much more vivid and much more, I think, grander than Lan's was. I just feel like Lan's chapters were more kind of filler than anything, and I just honestly thought that if he was going to be involved in this as much as he was, we should have seen more from him, learn more about him, learn more about what exactly his thoughts are in this world, because I just felt like he was kind of given the short end of the stick with this, and that's why I kind of brought my rating down a lot, because I think if this had been longer, we would have gotten a lot more time with him and understanding as to like some of the questions surrounding around why does he not really trust the Aes Sedai? Is it a product of his environment because people don't really trust him very well, or is there something specific that happened involving an Aes Sedai? And then on top of that, like I said, at the end, I would have liked to have seen how he and Moiraine work together. How is it that he's able to work with her that makes it so that by the time the Eye of the World comes up, where it's 20 years after this whole story, how has their dynamic progressed to where they are in the Eye of the World? Because in the Eye of the World, they seem to work very well together, but this was supposed to be kind of that origin story of them, and we don't really get to see a lot of that progression of the dynamic. So I feel like this honestly just had a lot of potential that was cut off very early. And I really wish it wasn't that way, because I feel like there's so much more to tell about Moiraine. And on top of that, in terms of like extending the end of this, I also would like to have seen Moraine's skills develop even more. We only really scratched the surface, I feel like, when it came to Moraine's powers and the fact that, you know, she has this ability. She ends up going through the trial and picking the Aes Sedai troop she's going to be a part of, but it doesn't really give us a lot of information as to like what exactly she now does in terms of her powers. What is she now able to do that she wasn't able to do before? Is she still learning things? Is she, you know, done with her training, and is she more adept at some of the skills she had already been honing? I would have liked to have seen a lot more of that, because I felt like that would have just made Moiraine a much more captivating character, as captivating as she was already. Like, I really liked her, and I'm very excited to see how her character is now different in the Eye of the World, because truthfully, when it came to the Eye of the World, when I first listened to the audiobook, I really couldn't grasp any of the story, let alone the characters, and so I would like to see how Moiraine fits into this world now in that regard, because now that I have this knowledge of her and where she kind of came from, I can't see where I would dislike her in the Eye of the World, unless she's kind of a rude, you know, little thing, which even then I would have liked to have seen how she became that way in this. So I feel like this was just a really missed opportunity with a lot of character exploration for these two characters because of the length. It truthfully felt like this was half of the story that was just cut off. Like, I feel like we're missing an entire other part of the story that would have just really helped to understand Moiraine a lot more and why she's so invested in the entire story of the Wheel of Time. But overall, it wasn't really that bad. I mean, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because I just felt like, like I said, it was about half of the story was here, but what was here was actually really cool, and I really, really liked it. Now, in terms of whether I think this is good to read before the Wheel of Time, because there are some people who will read the entire Wheel of Time series and then go back to this, I am actually of the opinion that you should read this before getting into the Wheel of Time at all if you are a new reader, because from my experience with having read The Eye of the World first and not really grasping a lot of it, and then coming back to this one about a year later to start off the whole series, because this is the origin story, and typically I like to go chronologically in terms of timeline of especially high fantasy stories, this was actually pretty well done to where I could understand the concept of the Aes Sedai a lot more, because from what I remember of The Eye of the World, the Aes Sedai and the functions of it didn't really get brought up a lot because we didn't get to see very many Aes Sedai other than Moiraine. So in terms of understanding the magic system of the Aes Sedai and the workings of this world and how the prophecy kind of came to be about what the Dragon Reborn is, that it gets talked about in the Wheel of Time, this I think is a much better start to the series. I think that you should always start with a prequel just to get a lay of the land and understanding some of the origins of the entire story before jumping into any high fantasy. And like I said, I think this is definitely one you would want to start with New Spring, just because I feel like it really sets up a lot in terms of understanding like the Aes Sedai. And on top of that, you just get to learn a lot about Moiraine before you actually see her for the first time in the Wheel of Time, so you get a good grasp of who she is as a person, and then we see her 20 years later and can kind of pretty much just emulate what we see and hear into that. So definitely would recommend reading this one first before starting the overall series. But that is all I have to say about New Spring. I really enjoyed it. I am, like I said, a little bit on the middle ground with this, but that's because the length of it I think really did a lot of disservice to this book, but I still really enjoyed a lot of it and am very excited to get into the Wheel of Time now officially. So thank you all so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!